At 34, $9 past broke and 6 months into a divorce that had taken most of what she owned, Emma Doyle stood at the base of a decommissioned lighthouse on a spit of rock called Cape Merrow, holding a set of keys that were supposed to open a door to nothing but debt. The county had already scheduled the light station for a private auction. The great-uncle who left it to her had been dead for a month, and Emma hadn't set foot on this rock in 19 years. But when she pried open a rusted hatch behind the old fog signal room, she found a logbook that didn't just belong to a lighthouse keeper. It belonged to the reason she existed at all. That part comes later. First, you should know how a 9-year-old girl learned to read a light the way other kids learn to read a clock. 6 months earlier, Emma had been a wife, or close enough to one that the difference hadn't fully registered yet. Her husband Paul had left in March, calmly, almost politely, the way people leave when they've already rehearsed it in their heads for a year. He kept the house. She kept Toby, who was 9, and a car with a check engine light that had been on so long she'd started to think of it as a dashboard decoration rather than a warning. The divorce lawyer's fee alone had eaten most of what she'd managed to save working 2 jobs, hostess shifts at a diner most mornings and bookkeeping for a plumbing company most afternoons. And by the time the papers were finalized, $9.40 was what stood between her checking account and zero. Paul's mother had never much cared for Emma, a fact that became easier to say out loud once the marriage was officially over. She'd hosted the last 2 custody handoffs herself, standing in her own doorway with her arms crossed while Toby hugged Emma goodbye, making it clear without ever quite saying so that she considered the whole arrangement a temporary embarrassment the family would eventually correct. Emma had learned to keep the handoffs short, businesslike, the way you'd conduct a transaction with someone who'd already decided what kind of person you were. It was easier than arguing. Everything that year had gotten easier once she stopped arguing about things she couldn't change and started simply doing the math on the things she could. She was standing in the plumbing company's back office, reconciling invoices on a laptop that ran hot enough to warm her hands, when a call came in from a number she didn't recognize. A lawyer named Mr. Ferris asking if she was the Emma Doyle related to a Franklin Doyle of Cape Merrow. She almost said no relation, out of habit, before the name landed properly. Uncle Frank. He's passed, Mr. Ferris told her, gently. The way people deliver news they've delivered 100 times before. 3 weeks ago. And you're named in his will as the sole beneficiary of the light station property, the keeper's cottage, and its contents. Emma had to sit down on an overturned bucket in the plumbing company's supply closet to absorb that. She hadn't spoken to Frank Doyle since she was 15. She hadn't, if she was honest with herself, thought about him more than a handful of times in 19 years, and each time it had come with a small twist of guilt she'd never fully examined. She remembered summers. 5 of them, ages 9 through 15, when her mother would drive her out to Cape Merrow every July and leave her with Great-Uncle Frank for 3 weeks at a stretch. Back when her mother was working double shifts at a hospital 2 towns over and needed somewhere safe to park a kid who asked too many questions. Frank's light station sat on a granite outcrop at the mouth of the harbor, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway that flooded at high tide. And Frank himself was a broad, weathered man who'd kept that light burning, on and off the Coast Guard payroll, for the better part of 40 years, long after automation made a live-in keeper technically unnecessary. It was on that rock that Frank taught her to tie a bowline with one hand, to read the tide tables like a second language, to send her name in Morse code by covering and uncovering the beam of a handheld lantern. Emma remembered being 11, furious and near tears because she couldn't get the fog signal timing right on the antique horn Frank kept as a backup, certain she'd broken something expensive. Frank had taken the crank from her hands, worked it twice himself, and said the sentence that ended up outlasting every other thing she remembered about that whole stretch of her childhood. No lights wasted, Em. Even the ones nobody's out there looking for get seen by somebody. There were other lessons woven into those summers, quieter ones. Frank taught her to splice a frayed line instead of throwing it out, to clean and re-oil the old Fresnel lens by hand even after the automated beacon made the ritual obsolete, because a thing built to save lives deserved better than neglect, just because it wasn't strictly required anymore. He taught her to listen to the marine radio at night for boats in trouble, and how to plot a rough position from a garbled distress call before the Coast Guard cutter even got underway. He never explained why he cared so much about strangers on the water. He just did, consistently, for as long as Emma could remember, in a way that made the caring itself feel like the only explanation that was ever going to be offered. There were smaller lessons too, the kind that only made sense to her much later. Frank taught her to identify an approaching weather change by the particular smell the harbor took on an hour before it broke. Sharp and metallic, nothing like the sweeter smell of ordinary rain. He taught her that a knot tied under tension told you more about a sailor's character than one tied at leisure, because anybody could manage a clean bowline with all the time in the world, but a boat going down didn't give you that luxury. And he taught her, more than once, that keeping the light clean mattered exactly as much on the nights no boat needed it as on the nights one did, because a keeper who only did the work when it was being watched wasn't really keeping anything at all. Emma remembered asking him once, at 12, why the Coast Guard didn't just let the automated beacon handle everything and save him the climb. He'd thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Machines keep a light burning, Em," he'd said. "They don't keep a light kept. There's a difference, even if nobody can measure it." She remembered one particular night more clearly than any other lesson. The summer she was 12, woken past midnight by Frank's hand on her shoulder, and told to get her boots on and not ask questions yet. A small sailboat had lost its rudder somewhere off the point in a rising chop, 2 teenagers aboard who'd taken it out without telling anyone, and Frank had needed a second pair of eyes on the beam while he worked the marine radio and plotted their drift by hand. Emma had stood in the lamp room in her pajamas and rain boots, holding a pair of binoculars nearly as big as her head, calling out every flicker of a running light she could find on the black water, while Frank talked calmly to 2 frightened kids over the radio until the Coast Guard cutter reached them. Afterward, walking back down the tower stairs as the sky started to gray, she'd asked him if he'd been scared. "A little," he admitted. "Scared's fine. Scared just means you're paying attention to the right thing. What you can't do is let it stop your hands from working." She hadn't understood, at 12, why that memory would end up mattering so much more than almost anything else about that whole summer. She understood it now, decades later, standing in the exact same lamp room with her own hands, finally doing the work that had once only been Frank's to do. The summer stopped when Emma was 15, over a disagreement she'd only ever heard her mother's side of. A hotel group had offered to buy the causeway-side acreage from Frank for a marina development, money that would have changed her mother's life at a moment when her mother badly needed her life changed, and Frank had refused, flatly, calling it disrespect for whoever might still need that stretch of coast to come ashore safely. Emma's mother had called it selfishness dressed up as principle. Something harder was said after that. On a phone Emma wasn't meant to be listening through the wall to, and the summer trips simply stopped being scheduled, the way plans quietly die when nobody objects to their absence. Emma remembered, though, the very last good day of that final summer, 3 weeks before the phone call that ended everything. A flat, calm morning when Frank had taken her out in the old dory to check the lobster pots he tended more out of habit than need, and had let her run the little outboard motor herself the whole way back in, correcting her heading with 2 fingers on the tiller and nothing else. He'd been quieter than usual that morning, and when she'd asked why, he'd just said he was trying to memorize the exact way the light looked on the water before the season turned. The way a person memorizes something they suspect they won't get an unlimited number of chances to see again. She hadn't understood the comment at 15. She understood it differently now, knowing what she knew about grief and 50 years of a man quietly measuring his days against a debt he felt he owed the water. Emma sent Frank exactly 1 letter as an adult, a wedding announcement, and got back a card that just said, "Proud of you, kid, keep your knots tight," in handwriting shakier than she remembered. That was the last contact either of them ever had. Emma remembered the actual night of the falling out more clearly than she'd ever admitted to anyone. 15 years old, and supposed to be asleep, sitting on the cottage stairs with her knees pulled up, while her mother's voice climbed on the other side of the wall. "You'd rather keep playing lighthouse keeper for strangers than help your own family," her mother had said, and Frank's answer had come back low and steady in a way that somehow made it worse. "Strangers are somebody's family too," Frank had said. "I can't pick and choose whose." Her mother hadn't had an answer for that, or hadn't wanted to give one, and the silence that followed had lasted 19 years. Emma's mother had grown up on that rock herself, in the years right after her own father drowned, raised by a great-uncle who loved her fiercely and clumsily in the specific way of a man who'd never planned on raising a child and hadn't the first idea how to do it without also trying to fix everything else broken within reach of his door. She'd told Emma once, years before the falling out, about learning to read by lantern light because Frank refused to run the generator past 9. About a particular Christmas when money was tight and Frank had spent what little he had on a stranger's unpaid heating bill instead of the bicycle she'd been hoping for, and how she'd cried about the bicycle for a week before she understood, much later, that the choice had never really been a betrayal so much as the only language the man knew how to speak. Emma hadn't thought about that story in years. She thought about it now, sitting with the green ledger in her lap, understanding for the first time that her mother's resentment and her mother's love for Frank had probably always been the exact same size, just aimed at each other instead of resolved. Now Frank was dead, and had apparently spent his final will thinking of a great niece he hadn't laid eyes on in 19 years. Mr. Ferris was the one who explained the timeline that made this more than an emotional inconvenience. The light station had been quietly deeded out of Coast Guard hands to Frank personally, decades earlier, in a small parcel transfer nobody at the county had bothered to properly refile since. Back taxes had accumulated. A private maritime heritage trust, underfunded and looking to offload liabilities, had scheduled the property for public auction in 70 days unless the back taxes and a structural safety bond were paid in full. Frank Doyle's own estate, once you subtracted his modest savings and funeral costs, covered almost none of it. "How much are we talking?" Emma asked, already bracing for an answer she wouldn't like. Mr. Ferris named a number substantial enough that Emma laughed out loud in an empty supply closet, the kind of laugh that has nothing to do with something being funny. She had $9.40, a 9-year-old who needed new sneakers, and now, apparently, a lighthouse. She drove out anyway. She told herself it was only to sign the paperwork required to let the county proceed with the auction cleanly, to close one more door in a year that had already closed most of the ones she cared about. She packed a single duffel bag, arranged 2 days off from both jobs by calling in a favor she didn't really have to spend, and buckled Toby into the back seat of the check engine light car for the 4-hour drive to Cape Merrow, because she couldn't afford a sitter and didn't want to leave him with Paul on a weekend that wasn't his. "Mom, what's a lighthouse for, exactly?" Toby asked from the back seat. Somewhere around hour 2, headphones around his neck instead of over his ears for once. "It tells boats where the rocks are," Emma said, "so they don't wreck on them in the dark." "How does it know where the boats are?" Toby pressed, the way 9-year-olds press on any answer that leaves room for a follow-up. "It doesn't, really," Emma said, surprising herself with how easily the old explanation came back. "It just keeps shining. The boats are the ones that have to be looking." An hour before the harbor road, they'd stopped at a diner attached to a gas station just off the coastal highway, the kind of place with a hand-painted lobster on the sign and a bell over the door that hadn't been oiled in years. The waitress, gray-haired and quick with the coffee pot, asked where they were headed, the way people do in towns small enough that a stranger passing through counts as news. When Emma mentioned Cape Merrow and the light station, the woman's expression shifted into something between recognition and sympathy. "Frank Doyle's place," she said. "Shame. What happened to that old man? My husband used to buy bait off him some summers. Never once let him pay full price, even though bait's about the only thing that man ever seemed willing to actually sell." She topped off Emma's coffee without being asked, and waved off payment for both cups, the first of what would turn out to be a great many small, unrequested kindnesses waiting for Emma along that stretch of coast, though she had no way of knowing that yet. Tired and over-caffeinated at a sticky diner counter, 2 exits from a lighthouse she barely remembered. The town of Cape Merrow hadn't changed as much as she expected. The same general store on the harbor road, the same church with the same white steeple, the same smell of low tide and diesel that she hadn't realized she'd missed until it hit her through the car window. She parked at the head of the causeway, where the tide was still low enough to cross, and sat for almost 10 minutes before she made herself get out. Toby already unbuckled and halfway out the door, drawn toward the water the way children are drawn toward anything large and unfamiliar. The light station itself was worse than she remembered, and somehow exactly the same. The white tower streaked gray with salt and neglect. The keeper's cottage beside it, with a section of roof tarped over in blue plastic, gone brittle from the sun. The old fog signal building's door hanging slightly ajar on one hinge. Gulls had colonized the gallery railing at the top of the tower. The whole rock smelled like rust and kelp and something else underneath it, faintly, that Emma's memory insisted on calling Frank's pipe tobacco, though there was no possible way that scent had survived a month of empty salt air. "Well, would you look at that?" a voice said from the causeway behind her. Didn't think anybody was coming out for this old girl. An older man stood there in rubber boots and a canvas jacket, a coil of rope over one shoulder, squinting at her with the particular scrutiny of someone deciding whether a stranger belongs somewhere. "I'm not a stranger." "Exactly," Emma said. "I think I just inherited this place." The man's eyebrows went up. "You're Frank's grandniece, the one from the will." "Word travels fast," Emma said. "Out here," the man said, "word doesn't travel. It just already knows what's coming before the mail does. Name's Sal. I've kept an eye on the harbor side of this rock for going on 30 years, back when Frank still had the light manned proper." Emma introduced herself, and Toby, who was already crouched at the edge of the causeway trying to catch something moving in the shallows, and Sal studied her face for a long moment with an expression she couldn't quite place until he spoke again. "You're the knot girl," he said. "Frank used to talk about you summers. A scrawny thing who could tie a bowline faster than half his old Coast Guard buddies. Didn't figure you'd come back looking quite so grown." Something tightened in Emma's chest at that. The idea of Frank telling that story to a harbor local for 19 years after she'd stopped writing back. Sal walked them across the causeway himself, pointing out which planks on the old boardwalk had rotted through, which section of the seawall not to lean on. He talked about the place the way people talk about something still alive, present tense, the way Emma realized with a small jolt that maybe nobody out here had really accepted that Frank was gone. Not completely, not yet. Inside the keeper's cottage, dust lay thick over everything. Sheets draped over the good furniture the way you'd dress a body for viewing. Emma pulled one back and found the same armchair she remembered curling up in as a kid, reading paperback adventure novels by lantern light, because Frank didn't believe in running the generator past 9. She walked from room to room touching things instead of just looking at them, an old habit Frank had drilled into her without ever explaining why. "You don't know what a piece of gear's telling you until your hands are on it," he used to say. "Your eyes'll lie to you, your hands won't." In the small back room that had served as Frank's radio station, her palm found a section of wall paneling that didn't sit quite flush with its neighbors, a hairline gap that hadn't been there, she was almost certain, the last time she'd stood in that room at 15. She pressed on it. It gave slightly, then held. Later, she told herself. Toby was already tugging her sleeve to see the top of the tower, and there was a 70-day countdown to deal with first, and she wasn't about to go digging into mysteries in a condemned lighthouse on her first afternoon back in 19 years. That patience, the choice to wait rather than force the seam open right then, was, she'd think much later, the most Frank thing she'd done since arriving. The county maritime office was a 40-minute drive around the harbor, and the woman behind the desk there, a tired administrator named Miss Alcott, laid out the situation with the flat efficiency of someone who had delivered this speech to a dozen confused heirs of a dozen crumbling heritage properties. 70 days now, she said, checking a calendar. Unless the back taxes are settled and a licensed engineer certifies the tower and cottage structurally sound, in which case the trust can grant an extension. Certification alone will run you a few thousand. The back taxes are considerably more than that. How much more? Emma asked, already knowing she wasn't going to like the number. Miss Alcott named a figure that made Emma sit back in her chair. She had $9.40 in checking, a 9-year-old asking when they could go back to the tower, and a to-do list that had just gotten a great deal more expensive than she could afford to think about directly. She drove back across the causeway before the tide came in fully, Toby asleep against the window, and sat on the keeper's cottage porch steps that evening, with a legal pad, doing math that refused to add up, no matter how many times she rearranged it. "You look like you're doing sums you don't like," Sal said, crossing the causeway with 2 mugs of something hot, steam rising into the evening chill. "I don't have this kind of money," Emma admitted. "I don't know what I thought was going to happen, driving out here." Sal sat down on the step below her, careful of his knees. "Frank didn't have much cash either. Near the end," he said. "Whatever you think he left you, it wasn't sitting in a bank account. But that man never gave away anything without a reason attached, even when the reason took him 30 years to explain. If he left you this rock in the shape it's in, he had a reason. Might take you a while to find it." Emma almost said that Frank hadn't spoken to her in 19 years, that whatever reason he had was buried along with every other thing he'd never explained while he was alive to do it. Instead, she just drank the coffee, which was better than the diner's, and didn't go looking at the seam in the radio room wall that night either. She went the next morning instead. In daylight, Toby occupied nearby stacking smooth stones along the seawall, a flathead screwdriver in hand that she'd found in a kitchen drawer still labeled in Frank's blocky handwriting. Odds and ends, do not lose. The seam gave way easier than she expected, the panel swinging inward on a hinge somebody had oiled recently enough that it barely creaked, revealing not a hole in the wall, but a narrow crawl space behind the old fog signal equipment, dry and cedar-lined, clearly built on purpose rather than left by accident. It took her most of the morning working up the nerve to actually climb inside, telling herself twice that she should call Sal first, not doing it either time. Inside the crawl space, on a shelf built at exactly the right height not to be visible from the doorway, sat a wooden chest with ropework handles Frank had clearly spliced himself, and beside it, a stack of leather-bound logbooks going back further than Emma could immediately date. The chest wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were 3 things: a thick bundle of loose papers tied with tarred marlin twine, a smaller ledger separate from the keeper's logs, bound in cracked green leather, and, at the very bottom, a sealed envelope with no name on it, just 6 words in Frank's hand: "For whoever keeps this light next." Emma sat down on the crawlspace floor with the small green ledger first, because it looked the least overwhelming of the 3. It wasn't a keeper's log in the official sense. Each page had a date, a set of initials or a name, and a short line describing what read, unmistakably, like a private act of charity. 1988. The Hutchins boy. Engine parts, so his father's boat doesn't sit dead through the season. 1994. Widow Alvarez. Mortgage payment. 3 months. Quietly. Tell her it was an insurance refund if she asks. 2001. RC. New outboard motor. Lost his in the November storm. Needs it for the lobster traps. The entries ran back nearly 50 years, and nearly up to the year before Frank died. Dozens of them. Sometimes just a boat part, sometimes real money. Never once with Frank's own name attached to the giving. Some entries had a short note beside the date, the kind of detail that made the ledger feel less like bookkeeping and more like a private confession. 1979. The Delacroix family, funeral costs, boy lost off the cormorant, don't let them know it wasn't the church fund. 1985. New nets for 3 boats after the spring squall, materials only, labor donated by whoever shows up. 2003. ST. Bus fare and a coat for the boy who got put off his uncle's boat. Cold snap in November. Left both on the porch and didn't knock. Emma found herself reading each one twice, trying to picture the person behind the initials, most of whom she'd never be able to identify, all of whom had gone on with their lives never knowing exactly who to thank. He'd been doing this his entire life, and never once mentioned it. Not to her. Not, apparently, to anyone. The bundle of papers was harder. They were letters, dozens of them, some in Frank's own hand and some in a hand she didn't recognize, dated across a span of 8 months, some 35 years earlier. The return address on the ones not written by Frank simply reading a merchant vessel's name and a post office box in a port city 3 states away. She read the first one twice before the shape of it made sense. A young man, a sailor named Michael, thanking Frank for pulling him out of the water after his fishing boat broke apart in a January storm, for nursing him back through a bad fever in the cottage's spare room for 6 weeks, for never once making him feel like a burden for washing up half-drowned on a stranger's rock. The later letters grew warmer, more personal, mentioning a woman Michael had met in town during his recovery, a local girl he was writing to as often as the mail routes between ports allowed. Emma's mother had grown up in Cape Merrow. Emma's mother had never once mentioned a man named Michael. One letter, written in Michael's own hand only 2 months before the storm that killed him, described the fever weeks in more detail than the others. How Frank had sat up 3 straight nights when the fever spiked. How he'd rowed to the mainland himself in weather no sensible man would risk, just to fetch a doctor who might not have come otherwise. How he'd never once, in 6 weeks of nursing a stranger back from the edge of dying, asked Michael a single question about who he was or where he'd come from before deciding he was worth the trouble. "You didn't ask if I was worth saving before you went in after me," Michael had written. "I don't think I've ever properly thanked you for that, and I'm not sure there's a way to." Another letter, lighter in tone, described the local girl he'd been courting during his recovery, a description so clearly, unmistakably her own grandmother, that Emma had to set the page down for a moment before she could keep reading. The last letter in the bundle wasn't from Michael. It was from a shipping company, terse and official, informing Frank as next listed emergency contact that seaman Michael Doyle had been lost overboard during a squall, 11 months after the fever. His body never recovered. Emma sat very still in the cedar-lined crawlspace for a long time after she understood what the surname on that letter meant. She did not open the sealed envelope yet. It felt heavier than paper should, and it felt like an answer she wasn't ready to receive. If you've stayed with Emma's story this long, go ahead and hit subscribe, because what she found in that envelope is the part that still catches in my throat every time I read it back. She carried the ledger and the letters out to the porch, where Sal was helping Toby skip stones, and asked him, as steadily as she could manage, whether he'd ever heard the name Michael Doyle. Sal's face changed in a way that told her the answer before he spoke it. "Your grandfather," he said quietly. "Everybody around here just called him Frank's boy, on account of how Frank took him in. Didn't know until years later he'd actually married your grandmother before he shipped out that last time. She was already carrying your mother by then. Died before the baby came. Poor thing. Grief and everything else. Frank raised your mother himself. Near enough. Until she was old enough to go live with cousins inland. Never talked about it much. Guess grief does that to some men. Makes silence feel safer than the alternative." Emma sat with that on the porch step, the ledger open in her lap, and understood in pieces what 19 years of family silence had actually been built on top of. Frank wasn't her great-uncle by some distant technical branch of the family tree. Frank was the man who had loved her actual grandfather like a son he'd pulled from the sea, who had raised her own mother through the worst of that loss, and who had gone on, quietly, for the rest of his life, making sure nobody else's family had to lose someone the way his had, one anonymous ledger entry at a time. "That's why the falling out cut so deep," Emma said slowly. "It wasn't really about the marina money at all." "Might not have been," Sal agreed. "Your mother grew up watching that man give strangers everything he had while she went without things a girl her age needed. Can't blame a kid for resenting that, even once she understood why he did it. And I don't imagine Frank ever found the right words to explain it to her before it was too late to matter." Emma opened the sealed envelope that evening, alone, after Toby had fallen asleep in the cottage's spare room under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and salt. Inside was a single page in Frank's careful, blocky hand, steadier than the last card he'd ever sent her, like he'd written it deliberately on a clear-headed day. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found the one thing on this rock I never let anyone else see. Your grandfather came out of that water because I wouldn't stop looking, even after the Coast Guard called off the search. I kept this light burning 50 years past the point anybody needed me to, because somewhere out there, some night, another boat was going to need exactly what nobody thought was worth keeping running. I couldn't save your grandfather the second time the water took him. I could keep the light on for whoever came after. That's the only inheritance worth leaving anybody, Em. Not what you save up, but what you keep burning for people you'll never meet. Keep it lit a while longer, if you can. If you can't, at least know somebody tried. Emma read that letter 3 times before she folded it back into its envelope, sitting alone on the porch with the harbor lights blinking faintly across the water, understanding for the first time in her adult life exactly what kind of man had spent every childhood summer teaching her to read the tides. The next morning she drove into the small-town archive above the library, a single dusty room kept by a retired schoolteacher named Ruth Kessler, no relation to anyone Emma had heard of, Ruth assured her, laughing, before Emma had even asked. And together they found a short newspaper item from 34 years earlier, 11 lines and no photograph, listing a local seaman lost overboard in a January squall, survived by a widow and an infant daughter, expected within weeks. It flattened her grandfather's entire unfinished life into a single paragraph of newsprint, the same way the county's own paperwork had once flattened Frank's. Tucked into the same folder, someone long ago had filed a wedding announcement clipping too, small and easy to miss, listing Michael Doyle and a young Cape Merrow woman married in a quiet ceremony that spring. Ruth dug a little further before Emma left that afternoon and turned up one more thing, tucked into a folder of old harbor social announcements nobody had opened in decades. A grainy photograph from a church fundraiser, a young man in a borrowed jacket standing slightly apart from the group, unmistakably favoring one leg the way a man recovering from a bad injury might. Ruth couldn't say for certain it was Michael, but she made a copy anyway and told Emma to keep it, on the chance that the quiet, careful-looking young man in the photograph was exactly who she thought he was. Emma carried that photocopy home along with the newspaper clipping and the wedding announcement and pinned all 3 to the wall of the radio room, not because she was certain of every detail, but because for the first time her grandfather existed somewhere outside of other people's second-hand memories. In paper she had found herself, with her own 2 hands, in a library archive in a town she'd once known only as somewhere to spend 3 weeks of summer. Emma bought a photocopy of both and carried them back across the causeway with the tide just beginning to rise around her boots. Sal came by most evenings that first week, always with some excuse that wasn't really the excuse. He'd caught more fish than he could eat alone. He wanted to check the causeway markers hadn't shifted. He was walking past anyway. Emma understood, somewhere around the 3rd evening, that Sal wasn't really checking on the tide markers. He was checking on her, the same unannounced, patient way Frank must have checked on half the harbor for 50 years without ever calling it that. I told myself years back I'd keep half an eye on whoever ended up with this rock, Sal admitted once, sitting on the porch step with 2 mugs of something hot. Didn't expect it'd be somebody I actually liked keeping an eye on. Emma had laughed at that, surprised by how easily it came after a year that hadn't given her much to laugh about, and told Sal she didn't need looking after. Sal had said, in the same flat, certain tone Frank apparently used for exactly this kind of argument, that everybody needed looking after whether they'd admit it or not, and that grief and exhaustion together made for a particularly poor judge of what a person actually required. After that, Sal started stopping by most evenings just to hear how the day had gone, and Emma found herself looking forward to it in a way she hadn't expected to look forward to anything again so soon. Sal had his own reasons for keeping such close watch over the rock. Reasons Emma only learned gradually, in pieces, the way people tell you the things that matter most only after they've decided you're worth the trouble. His wife had passed 11 years earlier, quietly, after a long illness, and Frank had been the one who sat with him most nights that final winter, not saying much, just making sure Sal didn't have to sit with it entirely alone. Never told me to get over it. Never told me it'd get easier, Sal said once, staring out at the water. Just kept showing up with a thermos and bad coffee until showing up stopped being something I had to brace myself for. I don't know that I ever really thanked him properly for that either. Guess that's becoming something of a pattern around here. One evening, weeks in, Emma finally asked Sal the question she'd been circling since her first day back, whether he thought Frank had been lonely, all those decades alone on the rock after her grandfather died and her mother grew up and left. Sal considered it a long time before answering. "Lonely's not quite the word I'd use," he said. "I think that man decided somewhere along the way that grief was just love with nowhere left to go, and instead of letting it curdle into something bitter, he found a way to keep spending it on people who'd never even know his name. Doesn't sound like loneliness to me. Sounds like the opposite, actually, if you squint at it right." Emma sat with that for a long time after Sal had gone home, turning the idea over the way Frank had once taught her to turn over an unfamiliar knot, testing it from every angle before deciding whether to trust it. Ms. Alcott, of all people, was the one who eventually mentioned the possibility that made staying financially conceivable at all. A small state heritage tourism grant available to privately maintained aid-to-navigation sites that opened their grounds to limited public visits, plus a modest stipend from the Regional Coast Guard Auxiliary for keepers who maintained an active emergency response radio watch. Neither amount alone would have covered much. Together, stacked against what she could still earn doing remote bookkeeping for her old firm 2 days a week, the math finally became something Emma could imagine actually living inside, rather than something that simply proved how impossible the whole idea was. She spent the following week doing something she hadn't expected to do at all, which was deciding to stay. She called both jobs and asked for as much unpaid leave as either would grant her, enrolled Toby temporarily in the small Cape Merrow Elementary School 2 miles up the harbor road, and began, in whatever hours daylight and low tide allowed, trying to figure out whether a broke, recently divorced bookkeeper had any business trying to save a lighthouse. The developer showed up on the 4th day, driving a car considerably nicer than anything else that had crossed the causeway that week. "You must be the niece," the man said, extending a hand Emma didn't take right away. "Derek Calloway. Frank was my great-uncle too, actually, other side of the family. I have to say, it's strange, meeting the person who ended up with all of it. All of it is a condemned lighthouse and a 70-day countdown," Emma said. "You're welcome to it if you want the paperwork that badly." Derek's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "There's been some confusion about how Frank's estate was supposed to be handled," he said. "I've been managing the trust's maintenance obligations on this property for the last 3 years, unpaid, I might add, while Frank's health declined. I was under the impression the family understood I had first right of refusal on any sale, given my history here." "I didn't know you existed until about 4 minutes ago," Emma said. "But the will says what it says. Wills can be revisited," Derek said, in the tone of a man who had already looked into exactly how, especially when the named heir has no relationship with the deceased, no ability to cover the outstanding debts, and a marina group willing to pay well over the tax burden for a clean transfer. "I'm not looking for a fight here, Emma. I'm looking for the sensible outcome. This tower comes down in 70 days regardless of whose name is on the deed, unless somebody with real capital steps in. Might as well be capital that keeps something of Frank's legacy alive, dressed up as a boutique inn instead of a pile of rubble." Emma didn't tell him about the crawlspace. She didn't tell him about the ledger, or the letters, or the sealed envelope now sitting in a drawer in the cottage 20 feet from where he stood. She told him she needed time to think, and watched him drive back across the causeway before the tide could trap his car there, already dialing someone before he'd cleared the seawall. What Emma didn't see that afternoon was Derek pulling over half a mile up the harbor road, engine idling, making a call he'd clearly been putting off. "I need you to hold the Marina Group's offer open a little longer," he said when the line picked up. "I know what I told them last month. There's a complication. Another heir showed up and she's not interested in selling yet." He listened for a long moment, jaw tight. "I need this to close before the auction date," he said finally, quieter. "I've got obligations here I can't keep pushing back." He hung up before whoever was on the other end could ask the follow-up question he clearly didn't have a good answer for, and sat there a while longer with his forehead against the steering wheel before he finally pulled back onto the road. What Emma also didn't know yet was that Derek's own charter boat business had gone under 2 winters earlier, that he'd sunk what savings he had left into a partnership that soured, and that the Marina Group's finder's fee for delivering a clean, undisputed sale of the light station was the only thing standing between him and losing his own house on the mainland side of the harbor. He had a wife, Nora, and 2 young daughters who'd already had to change schools once when the charter business folded, and Nora had asked him more than once, gently but pointedly, why he kept driving out to check on his great-uncle's crumbling lighthouse when their own mortgage was the thing actually keeping her up at night. He'd never quite found a way to explain to her that some part of him had kept hoping those visits might eventually be worth something more than obligation. And he hated how thin that hope sounded whenever he tried to say it out loud. He told himself the sale wasn't really about greed, that it was about keeping his family afloat long enough to start over properly. And some nights that story even held together until morning. Emma spent that evening sitting on the cottage porch with the green ledger in her lap, turning over a decision she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet. Derek's marina money, whatever the exact figure turned out to be, would clear every debt the divorce had left behind, and then some. Nobody would have blamed her, least of all a great-uncle she'd barely spoken to in 19 years. She thought about it seriously, for the better part of an hour, and then she thought about the entry for Widow Alvarez's mortgage, about a man who'd spent 50 years finding reasons to give money away quietly instead of keeping it, and she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that selling wouldn't just be practical. It would be the one thing on this rock Frank never would have forgiven, and now that she'd read his ledger, the one thing she couldn't forgive in herself either. The next morning, she went to see the harbor's general store owner, a woman named Delia Fontaine who'd run the shop since before Emma's childhood summers, and remembered her instantly, mostly because Frank used to bring young Emma in every July to pick out her own fishing line. Said a sailor ought to choose her own gear from the start. Delia listened to the whole situation, the back taxes, the 70 days, the engineer's certification she couldn't afford, and then did something Emma hadn't expected at all, which was to pick up the store's phone and start calling people. "Word moves fast around here, doesn't it?" Emma said. "Word doesn't move," Delia said, echoing Sal almost exactly. "It just already knows where it's needed." Miss Alcott's office called twice that week with additional requirements Emma hadn't anticipated. A soil survey for the causeway footing, proof of insurance before any structural work could legally begin, a separate historic preservation review triggered automatically by the tower's age that added another layer of paperwork nobody had mentioned during the first visit. Emma spent 2 full days on the phone navigating a bureaucracy that seemed designed to exhaust anyone without a lawyer on retainer, filling out forms in the cottage kitchen by lamplight because the tower still had no reliable power, and twice nearly gave up entirely before Mr. Ferris, unprompted, offered to handle the historic preservation, filing himself at no charge, saying simply that Frank had been a client of his for 30 years and he wasn't about to let paperwork be the thing that undid what the man spent his whole life building. Within 4 days, a retired structural engineer named Voss, who'd inspected half the piers on that stretch of coast for free favors over the decades, had climbed the tower himself and started drafting the certification paperwork at cost. Sal organized 2 of his old fishing buddies to help clear debris from the cottage and retar the roof properly. A retired electrician named Odom, who'd once had his own boat engine rebuilt by Frank for the price of the parts alone, rewired the tower's automated beacon system for nothing but gas money and the promise of first coffee every morning he showed up. A young mother named Priya Nair, who ran the harbor's small bait and tackle counter and had heard the story secondhand from Delia, spent 2 Saturdays helping Emma scrub 50 years of salt grime off the lamp room's brass fittings, refusing anything but a thermos of coffee in return, and telling Emma partway through that her own father had once had a debt quietly forgiven by a man named Doyle after a bad lobster season, though she'd never known the details until now. A retired Coast Guard officer named Whitcomb, who'd served 2 tours on this very stretch of coast decades earlier, drove out unannounced one weekend with a truck full of salvaged hardware and spent an entire day going over the tower's mechanical systems with Odom, the two of them arguing companionably about wiring gauges like old friends who'd simply been waiting for a reason to be useful again. Emma learned, over those first restoration weeks, to read the volunteers themselves almost the way Frank had taught her to read tide tables. Which ones needed a task with a clear beginning and end to feel useful? Which ones needed the work to stretch out slow enough to leave room for talking? Which ones, like Voss, simply needed to be left alone with a clipboard and trusted completely? She learned to keep a thermos going at all hours, because half the actual conversations that mattered happened over coffee rather than over tools, and she learned, faster than she expected, that a harbor town's currency wasn't really favors owed and repaid so much as attention paid and eventually returned, sometimes decades later, sometimes to a person who'd never even asked for it. Working alongside this rotating crew of volunteers taught Emma things the Lighthouse alone couldn't have. She learned which of them needed her to simply hand over a tool and step back, and which needed 5 minutes of conversation more than they needed the help itself. Whitcomb, in particular, talked more than he worked those first few visits, telling long stories about Frank's Coast Guard years that nobody currently living had heard in full, and Emma found herself, more than once, just sitting on an overturned bucket listening instead of scrubbing, because some kinds of restoration mattered as much as the physical kind. Whitcomb told her, one long afternoon, about the winter Frank had refused a transfer to an easier posting twice, back when the Coast Guard was actively trying to promote him off the rock and into a desk job in the regional office. Whitcomb had been young and green the winter Michael Doyle went into the water the second time, still new enough to the service that the older keepers hadn't quite trusted him with anything beyond radio watch. He remembered the official search running for 18 hours before the cutter captain called it weather worsening, odds gone from slim to none. He remembered Frank refusing to come down off the tower even after the official search ended, keeping the light and the radio manned alone through 2 more full days on nothing but coffee and whatever hope a man could manufacture out of pure stubbornness. Wasn't rational, Whitcomb said quietly. Everybody knew it wasn't rational by the second day. But I think some part of him decided right then that giving up on a light too early was the one mistake he was never going to let himself make twice, and he spent the next 50 years making good on that decision for strangers who never even knew there'd been a first time he'd failed to save the one that mattered most. Man could have had a pension and a warm office chair 15 years earlier than he took it, Whitcomb said, shaking his head at the memory. Told the review board, straight to their faces, that a light didn't keep itself just because a man got tired of climbing stairs, and that he'd rather die on this rock doing the job right than die comfortable somewhere doing nothing at all. They let him stay. Half the department thought he was a fool for turning down the promotion. The other half, Whitcomb said quietly, understood exactly why he'd done it, even if none of them could have explained it as plainly as Frank just had. Paul called on the 5th day, his voice carrying the particular patience of a man who'd rehearsed his concern before dialing. "You can't just pull Toby out of school and park him on a rock in the middle of nowhere, Emma," he said. "My mother thinks this whole thing sounds unstable, and frankly, so do I." Emma had explained, as evenly as she could manage, the 70-day countdown, the inheritance, the fact that Toby had already been enrolled properly at the local elementary school, and was, by every account she'd gotten from his new teacher, doing better than he had in months. Paul hadn't been fully convinced, and said as much, mentioning offhand that his mother had already looked into what it would take to petition for a temporary change in the custody schedule if Emma kept the boy out of his home district much longer. It wasn't a threat exactly. It landed like one anyway, and Emma spent that whole evening rereading the custody agreement by lamplight, looking for whatever ground she actually had to stand on, before deciding, the same way she'd decided about the marina money, that she wasn't going to make a decision about Toby's life out of fear of a phone call. Toby, for his part, adjusted to Cape Merrow faster than Emma did, coming home from the tiny elementary school with a scraped knee and a new best friend named Wyatt within the first week, and spending most afternoons with Sal, learning to identify knots by feel with his eyes closed, the same game Frank had once played with Emma at exactly Toby's age, though Emma had never told Sal that, and Sal had apparently invented the exact same lesson independently, or remembered it from watching Frank teach it decades earlier without quite realizing he'd absorbed it. It wasn't all easy for him. Toby had a hard week in late September when a classmate asked, with the blunt curiosity of a 9-year-old, why his parents didn't live together, and he'd come home from school quiet and unwilling to talk about it, disappearing into the cottage's spare room instead of his usual habit of narrating his entire day before he'd even taken off his shoes. Emma sat outside the door for a while before deciding not to push. The same instinct Frank's old lessons about patience seemed to apply to people as much as rope work. It was Sal, unprompted, who eventually coaxed him back out, mentioning offhand that his own father had left when Sal was about Toby's age, and that it had taken him years to understand it wasn't something he'd caused and wasn't something that made him any less worth sticking around for. Toby hadn't said much in response, but he'd come to dinner that night, and by the following week he was narrating his days again in full, uninterrupted detail, the particular relief of a kid who'd needed to hear, from someone other than his mother, that he wasn't the reason anything had broken. Toby, for his part, had started keeping his own small list, the way Frank once had and Emma now did without quite meaning to start the habit again. Names of people who'd shown up to help, scratched onto the back of a school worksheet so he wouldn't forget who to thank. He'd asked Sal one afternoon while they worked a length of line between them whether the lighthouse missed having somebody living in it full time. Sal had thought about that longer than the question seemed to warrant before answering. "Buildings don't miss anything, kid," he'd said, "but the folks who depend on it sure noticed when the light started going dark some nights toward the end, before your mother came back." Toby had gone quiet at that, and started, from then on, checking the beacon himself every evening before bed, a habit nobody had asked him to take up, and nobody suggested he stop. The storm hit on the 11th night, earlier and harder than the forecast had promised, catching Odom's half-finished rewiring job exposed to weather it wasn't ready for. Emma spent 4 hours in the dark with a headlamp and 2 borrowed rain slickers, holding a tarp over the open panel while wind tried to rip it out of her hands, worried less about the equipment than about the fact that without a working light, any boat caught out past the point in this weather would have nothing at all to steer by. Somewhere past midnight, marine radio crackling from the cottage window behind her, she heard exactly the kind of call Frank had trained her ear to catch decades earlier. A small fishing boat, engine trouble, taking on water somewhere off the point, position uncertain in the dark. For one long, frozen second, Emma stood there with the tarp still gripped in both hands, wind screaming past her ears, running through the same calculation Frank must have run 1,000 times in 50 years on this rock. The tower stairs were slick, the automated system was down, and the old backup lamp hadn't been fired since long before he died. There was no guarantee it would even catch. There was no time to find out any other way. "Odom," she shouted over the wind. "Take the tarp." He didn't ask why. He just grabbed it, and Emma was already running. She left the tarp to Odom and ran for the tower stairs. The automated system was still down. The backup lamp Frank had kept maintained for exactly this kind of emergency, untouched in its housing, for who knew how many years. Emma's hands remembered the mechanism before her mind fully caught up. The same crank motion Frank had put her hands through 100 times at age 11, and the old lamp caught on the third try, its beam sweeping out across black water in the same slow rhythm Frank had drilled into her by lantern light half a lifetime ago. Toby had woken to the sound of the door slamming and found the cottage empty, Odom still fighting the wind outside with the tarp, and had done the one thing Emma hadn't thought to prepare him for, which was climb the tower stairs himself in the dark to find her, arriving in the lamp room just as the old lamp caught on its third try. He didn't say anything. He just stood pressed against the wall out of the way, watching his mother work the crank with the same total concentration Frank must have once worn on his own face, doing the exact same motion. And later, once the fishing boat's lights had cleared the point, he told her, in the flat, matter-of-fact voice children sometimes use for the things that scare them most, that he hadn't wanted her doing that alone. Emma hadn't had an answer ready for that. She just held on to him for a while in the cold lamp room, both of them soaked and shaking for entirely different reasons, before they climbed back down together. The fishing boat's captain, a young man named Ortega who'd grown up 2 towns over and had never once met Frank Doyle, later swore to anyone who'd listen that he'd given up trying to find the point in that weather, certain he was about to run his boat straight onto the rocks, when an old lighthouse everybody said had gone dark years ago suddenly swept a beam across his bow at exactly the angle he needed to correct his heading. No lights wasted, Emma said out loud to no one, standing alone in the lamp room at 2 in the morning, soaked through and shaking, watching the fishing boat's running lights finally clear the point and turn safely toward harbor. Even the ones nobody's out there looking for. By morning, half the harbor knew a version of the story, and for the first time since Emma had crossed that causeway, people stopped treating the light station like an inconvenient relic and started treating it like something worth finishing. Derek came back 6 days before the auction date, this time with a lawyer of his own, a young associate named Priyanka, who looked like she'd rather be handling almost any other case on her docket. "We've filed a challenge to the will's validity," Derek said, sliding a folder across the porch railing. "Grounds of insufficient familial contact and improper estate management going back years before Frank's death. Given the timeline, it's in everyone's interest to settle before this reaches a judge." Emma had spent the previous week doing something Derek clearly hadn't anticipated, cross-referencing every document Mr. Ferris had sent her against the Green Ledger's dates, and making one careful phone call of her own to the Maritime Trust's own records office. "Mr. Ferris sent something over yesterday," Emma said. "Frank amended his will 11 years ago, specifically naming me, specifically stating his reasons, that he wanted the light kept by, and I'm quoting directly here, the only one left in this family who ever asked what the light was for instead of what it was worth. 11 years, Derek. Long before anyone could argue his judgment was compromised." Priyanka was already reading over Derek's shoulder, her expression shifting the way expressions shift when a case starts dissolving in real time. "There's something else," Emma said, and went inside, returning with the Green Ledger open to a page marked with a strip of tarred twine. 1994, she read aloud. D.C. Engine class tuition, 2 semesters, so the boy's got something steadier than his father's boat under him. Anonymous. Don't tell him where it came from. Derek went very still. "Your great-uncle paid for your captain's license training," Emma said quietly. "Anonymously. You never knew, did you?" "I got a scholarship," Derek said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice entirely. "A maritime trade grant, they called it. Nobody ever told me who arranged it." "It was him," Emma said. "It's in his own hand. There are entries like this going back 50 years, Derek. Half this harbor. Boat repairs, mortgage payments, funeral costs for men lost at sea, your training. He never told a single soul, and he never once asked for anything back." Derek sat down hard on the porch steps, the folder from his lawyer forgotten in his lap. Priyanka, still holding the folder that had brought her out here, looked between the two of them and asked, quietly, whether Derek wanted a moment before they discussed next steps. He waved her off, not unkindly, and sat with the ledger a while longer, running his thumb over his own initials, the way a person checks whether something written a long time ago is still real when you touch it a second time. "I used to resent this rock," Derek admitted, still staring at the page. "Every time I drove out to check on Frank these last few years, I told myself I was doing the family a favor nobody else wanted to do. Some nights I even believed it. Other nights I think I just kept coming, because some part of me already sensed there was something out here I hadn't earned an explanation for yet." "My father drowned when I was 12, he said finally, quietly, the words coming loose like something that had been wedged in place for years. "Lobster boat, bad weather, same kind of story half this coast's got buried in it somewhere. I've spent 20 years telling myself Frank owed me something, because I was the one who kept showing up to check on him these last few years, while everybody else forgot he existed. And it turns out he'd already given me more than I ever gave him, and I never even knew enough to be grateful. Priyanka quietly excused herself to make a phone call and returned a few minutes later to tell Derek the challenge would almost certainly not survive a hearing, not against an 11-year-old notarized amendment and a documented, decades-long pattern of the deceased's own stated intentions. Word of the second visit had traveled faster than Derek's car. By the time Priyanka finished speaking, 2 more trucks had pulled up at the head of the causeway. Delia, still in her store apron, and Whitcomb, arms crossed, studying Derek with the particular stillness of a man deciding whether a fight was worth having. Delia spoke up first, her voice steady despite her age. "I've run that store on this harbor for 30 years, she said, looking at Derek, "and I have never once seen anybody work as hard for something as this woman has for a rock half this county already wrote off as lost. You ought to be ashamed," making her prove it twice. Whitcomb just nodded once, like that settled the matter as far as he was concerned. Sal had wandered over partway through the conversation, drawn by the unfamiliar car, and stood at the porch's edge listening without saying much, the way he seemed to at every important turn in this whole strange homecoming. "Derek," Sal said finally, "you should know your great-uncle talked about you too. Not as often as he talked about Emma here, but he kept a photo of you at your captain's ceremony pinned up in the radio room for years. Told me once he was prouder of that boy than he had any right to claim credit for being." Derek put his head in his hands for a long moment, and when he looked up, something in his face had shifted, the way a strained line finally goes slack once the load pulling on it lets go. "I don't want to fight you for this anymore," he told Emma. "I'm not sure I ever really did. I think I just didn't know what else to do with feeling forgotten by the one person who was supposed to remember me." "He didn't forget you," Emma said. "He just had a strange way of remembering people, out loud, to strangers, in a ledger nobody was ever supposed to read." Derek called the Marina Group himself 2 days after the porch confrontation, Emma standing beside him on the causeway while he did it, and told them plainly that the light station was no longer available at any price, that the family had resolved its internal disagreement, and that he'd appreciate them removing the property from their prospect list entirely. The man on the other end pushed back once, mentioning the finder's fee Derek would be forfeiting, and Derek had simply said that some fees weren't worth what they cost, and hung up before the conversation could go any further. Emma didn't say anything afterward. She just squeezed his arm once, and Derek, who looked like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying for longer than he'd admitted even to himself, let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his lungs. The Maritime Trust granted the extension 4 days before the original deadline, on the strength of the completed structural certification and a will contest formally withdrawn. The tower didn't come down. Over the following weeks, it came back instead. The beacon fully rewired and recertified, the cottage roof properly shingled, the old Fresnel lens cleaned and reset by Voss's engineering crew almost as a courtesy once word of the storm rescue made its way around the harbor. Cleaning the lens itself became something of a ritual for Emma, the same one Frank had once shown her as a kid. A soft cloth, a particular grade of polish, careful circular motions that took the better part of an afternoon to do properly. She did it every week whether the automated system needed it or not, exactly the way Frank once had, understanding now, with her own hands doing the work, precisely what he'd meant about the difference between a light that burned and a light that was kept. Toby took to sitting cross-legged on the lamp room floor during these sessions, not really helping so much as absorbing the ritual itself, the way children absorb the shape of a thing long before they understand its purpose. Miss Alcott herself drove out unannounced the week after the extension was granted, ostensibly to file the final paperwork in person, though she stayed for nearly 2 hours looking at the restored tower with an expression Emma hadn't expected from a county administrator who'd delivered dozens of identical bad news speeches to dozens of identical heirs. "I process about a dozen of these estates a year," Miss Alcott admitted, standing at the base of the tower. "Most of them end in a demolition permit and a for sale sign on empty land. I don't think I've ever once had somebody actually pull it off. She left her direct office line with Emma before she left, telling her to call personally, not through the general line, if any future paperwork ever threatened to bury the place again. An offer Emma understood to be its own quiet, bureaucratic version of the same currency Sal and Delia dealt in. Emma finished the crawlspace last, on purpose, building a proper shelf and a small hinged door where the hidden panel used to be, so nobody after her would ever need to pry open a wall to find what Frank had left behind. She hung a small brass plate beside it that read simply, "Frank's Watch," and left the green ledger inside it, available now to anyone in town who ever wondered where an old, unexplained kindness might have come from. The Heritage Tourism Grant required limited public access as a condition of funding, and Emma opened the grounds for the first time on a Saturday in late July, uncertain whether anyone would actually come. 40 people crossed the causeway that first weekend, mostly locals who'd never once had a reason to set foot on the rock, despite living their whole lives within sight of its beam. And Emma found herself giving the same tour Frank had once given her privately, one lesson at a time, over and over, to strangers who lingered afterward on the lawn asking questions about tide tables and Fresnel lenses, like people rediscovering a language they hadn't realized they'd once half known. Sal took to running the tours on weekends. Emma couldn't manage both jobs, and told her more than once that watching strangers' faces change when the beam swept overhead at dusk was its own kind of payment, better than the modest grant money the county eventually wired through. By late summer, half the harbor had some version of the story, and people started showing up at the light station the way they must have quietly shown up at Frank's door for 50 years, except now it was Emma on the receiving end of casseroles and boat parts and offers to help finish the last of the cottage trim. Derek came by more than once, not to argue, just to help, spending one whole weekend re-splicing the causeway's rope railings without being asked, the way people do when they're trying to become the kind of person they wish they'd been sooner. A reporter from the regional paper drove out one Saturday, having heard some second-hand version of the storm rescue from a fisherman at the harbor bar, and asked if she could write the story up properly. Emma almost said no, still uneasy about turning a private grief into public reading material, but Sal convinced her that 50 years of quiet, anonymous kindness deserved better than staying quiet forever, and that the harbor owed Frank at least one afternoon of being thanked out loud instead of in secret. The piece that ran 2 weeks later wasn't really about a condemned lighthouse or a contested will at all. It was about a keeper who'd spent half a century rebuilding a harbor town, one anonymous act at a time, and a great niece who showed up, broke and grieving, and found the whole ledger of it waiting behind a hidden panel. Delia pinned a copy behind the register at the general store. Sal kept one folded in his tackle box. Derek, when he saw it, asked Emma quietly if he could have a copy too, and folded it twice before tucking it into his jacket without saying why. A week after the article ran, a heavy-set man in his 40s showed up at the causeway, introducing himself as the Hutchins boy, though he was well past being anyone's boy by then, holding a newspaper clipping of his own. He'd read the piece and recognized his own family's name from a story his father used to tell, about a season when their boat's engine failed right before the fall run, and money to fix it simply appeared, no explanation given, delivered by a man everyone just assumed was being a good neighbor, in the ordinary sense rather than the extraordinary one. "My dad kept fishing another 11 years because of whatever your uncle did that winter," the man told Emma, standing at the edge of the lawn turning his cap over in his hands. "Put 3 kids through school off that boat. I never got to say thank you to the right person, and I figured this was as close as I'd ever get." He left a jar of his wife's preserves on the porch rail before he drove back across the causeway. The same unassuming currency half the harbor seemed to speak fluently without ever having been taught it directly. Delia was the one who finally tracked down Widow Alvarez, well into her 90s now, and living with a granddaughter 2 towns inland, the same woman whose mortgage Frank had quietly covered for 3 months back in 1994. Emma drove out to meet her personally, bringing the ledger page itself, photocopied and framed, and the old woman studied it for a long while, with fingers that trembled slightly before she spoke. "I always thought that was the insurance company being unusually generous," she said. Told everyone who asked exactly that story for 30 years. She looked up at Emma with eyes gone cloudy but still sharp underneath it. He never once let on, all the times I saw him afterward at church. Just asked after my garden like any other neighbor would. Emma left the framed copy with her, and the widow held on to it with both hands the whole time Emma stayed, as though something she'd carried unknowingly for 3 decades had finally been allowed to set itself down. A quieter visit came a few weeks after that, an older lobsterman who introduced himself only as R.C. and asked, almost apologetically, whether the newspaper story was really about Frank Doyle, the same Frank Doyle who'd once replaced an outboard motor he'd lost in a November storm, without ever explaining where the replacement came from. "That was you," Emma said, and he nodded, embarrassed, admitting he'd spent 30 years assuming it was insurance money he'd simply forgotten filing for. "Kept fishing another 3 decades because of that motor," he told her. "Put a daughter through nursing school on the back of it. I'd have thanked him 100 times over if I'd known who to thank. He didn't leave anything on the porch rail the way the Hutchins boy had. He just stood there a while, looking at the tower, and then shook Emma's hand twice before he left, the second time longer than the first." Emma added both names to the small list she'd started keeping in the back of the green ledger, a second column beside Frank's original entries, tracking not what had been given but who, over the following months, had finally found their way back to say so. In late October, not long after Caleb's uncle had come to trust the light station enough to let the boy keep coming back on his own, Emma finally called her mother, a conversation she'd been circling for weeks without managing to start it properly. She told her about the crawlspace, about the letters, about Michael Doyle and the 50 years of quiet giving that had followed his death. There was a long silence on the line before her mother finally spoke. "I always wondered if I was wrong to let it go on that long," her mother admitted, her voice thinner than Emma remembered it ever being. "I grew up watching that man give everything he had to strangers while I went without things a kid needs, and I never once let myself ask why, because some part of me already knew the answer would make my anger feel smaller than I needed it to feel at the time." Emma told her about the entry for a mortgage payment on a young widow in 1994, a name and date that lined up, once she'd cross-referenced it carefully, with a difficult winter her own mother had once mentioned in passing years ago, and never explained. Her mother went quiet again, and when she spoke next, it wasn't quite an apology, just a request. Could she come out, sometime soon, and see the light for herself? Emma said yes before her mother had even finished asking. Her mother arrived on a gray Saturday 2 weeks later, standing at the head of the causeway with a suitcase she hadn't fully committed to unpacking, looking at the restored tower the way a person looks at a photograph of somewhere they used to live. She didn't say much on the walk across. She stood a long while in the radio room doorway instead, looking at the small brass plate reading Frank's watch, before she finally spoke. "He used to sit me right there," she said, pointing to a spot by the old window, "and read me the shipping reports like they were bedtime stories, back before I was old enough to understand why he cared so much what happened to strangers on boats I'd never see. I resented him for loving people I couldn't name, more than he seemed to love the family in front of him. I didn't understand until you called me that he wasn't choosing them over us. He just never learned how to explain that grief could turn into that much kindness without somebody teaching him a better way to say it out loud." She cried then, quietly, the first time Emma had seen her mother cry over anything connected to Frank in her entire life. And Emma put an arm around her and didn't say anything at all, because some grief just needed somewhere to finally land. They stayed up late that night in the cottage kitchen, her mother reading through the green ledger page by page under lamplight, occasionally recognizing a name or a year and saying it aloud like she was reintroducing herself to a version of her own childhood she'd spent 19 years refusing to look at directly. Toby's 10th birthday landed in late November, and half the harbor showed up for it uninvited in the way Cape Merrow apparently did everything. Sal teaching him to splice his first line properly with his own 2 hands, Delia bringing a cake shaped badly and lovingly, like a lighthouse, Odom letting him flip the switch on the fully restored beacon himself at dusk, while the whole gathered crowd on the cottage lawn watched the light sweep out across darkening water for the first time under Toby's own hand. That was the same week a small aluminum skiff washed up against the causeway rocks after a late autumn squall, no engine, one occupant, a teenage boy named Caleb, half frozen and badly frightened, who'd taken his uncle's boat out without permission and lost the engine somewhere past the point when the weather turned. Sal pulled him out of the water. Emma wrapped him in the same kind of quilt Frank had once wrapped around a drowning stranger named Michael Doyle, and sat with him by the cottage stove until his shaking stopped and his uncle could be reached by phone. "You're not in trouble here," Emma told him when he finally started apologizing between chattering teeth. "You're just cold and scared, and that's not the same thing." "Why would you even bother with me?" Caleb asked. "You don't know me." "Somebody didn't know my grandfather either, once," Emma said. "Pulled him out of water a lot colder than this, and never once asked what it would cost him. Took our family the better part of 50 years, and a hidden ledger to understand why. I'd rather you not have to wait that long to get it." Caleb's uncle, a lobsterman named Reyes who arrived at the causeway, white-faced and furious with relief, in roughly equal measure, sat at Emma's kitchen table that same night, while Caleb stammered through an apology for taking the boat without asking. Reyes had let him finish, then said, more gently than Emma expected from a man who'd spent the last 3 hours imagining the worst, that he wasn't angry about the boat. "I don't care about the boat," Reyes said. "I care that I almost had to call your mother and tell her I lost you the same way the water took your grandfather." Caleb had gone very quiet at that, and Emma understood, watching the two of them, that the fear underneath Reyes's anger and the fear underneath Caleb's reckless afternoon on the water were probably the same fear wearing two different faces, the kind of thing families rarely manage to say to each other plainly until a near miss forced the words out. Caleb stayed the night in the cottage's spare room and came back 3 more times that autumn on his own, first to apologize properly to his uncle in Emma's kitchen, and then simply because, as he admitted once, quietly, it was the only place on the whole coast that had ever made him feel like being rescued wasn't the same thing as being a burden. By his 4th visit, Caleb had started showing up with his uncle's old fishing gear in tow, asking Sal to teach him the splicing knots properly this time, the way a boy asks for something he's decided matters after nearly losing his life for want of knowing it. Toby, delighted to suddenly have someone closer to his own age hanging around the light station on weekends, adopted Caleb almost instantly as an older brother figure, following him around the causeway, asking questions Caleb answered with more patience than Emma expected from a 16-year-old still visibly rattled by his own close call. Sal took to teaching them both together, and some Saturday afternoons the sound of 2 boys arguing cheerfully over whose knot held tighter carried clear across the water to the general store, where Delia said it was the first sound in years that made the whole harbor feel like it had its rhythm back. The newspaper reporter came back a second time in November, having heard about the skiff rescue from Whitcomb at the harbor bar, and asked whether she could add a follow-up to the original piece. This one ran with a photograph of Toby and Caleb standing together at the base of the tower, and the headline focused less on Frank's 50 years of quiet giving and more on what Emma had chosen to do with what she'd inherited from it. Derek, reading it at his own kitchen table with Nora looking over his shoulder, told her it was the first time in longer than he could remember that a newspaper story about his family had made him feel proud instead of embarrassed. By November, Emma had made the decision she'd been circling since the night of the storm, giving notice at both her old jobs and taking on the light station's unofficial keeper duties herself, splitting her time between Cape Merrow and the mainland only as much as Toby's schooling required. Derek helped her file the paperwork to formally register as a private aid to navigation keeper, a designation that hadn't been actively used on that stretch of coast in over a decade. Mostly, he admitted, because he wanted an excuse to keep coming back across the causeway himself. The designation itself required more than paperwork. Whitcomb insisted on personally walking her through the Coast Guard's old keeper protocols, radio procedures, emergency signaling, the specific maintenance log format the regional office still technically required, even for a privately registered light, and Emma spent 3 separate weekends being quizzed by a retired officer twice her age, who took the whole exercise more seriously than any job interview she'd ever sat through. "You're not just fixing up a tourist attraction," he told her, more than once. "You're taking on a legal responsibility to every boat that comes past this point." Frank never once treated it as anything less than that, and neither should you. She passed the informal certification he administered on her 3rd attempt, and Whitcomb, gruff as he'd been through the whole process, shook her hand afterward with something that looked suspiciously like pride. That first Christmas, the cottage had real guests for the first time in years. Sal, Delia, Whitcomb, Priya and her family, even Derek and Nora and their 2 daughters, who spent most of the afternoon in the radio room with Toby and Caleb, learning to send their own names out across the water in Morse code using a handheld lantern, exactly the way Frank had once taught a 9-year-old Emma to do it. Emma watched Derek's younger daughter hold up the lantern for her father's approval, the same way Emma herself had once held up a coil of rope for Frank, and thought that some lessons apparently just kept finding their way to whoever happened to be standing closest when they were needed. Her mother stayed through the new year, longer than either of them had originally planned, helping Emma sort through the last of the cottage's back rooms and finding, more than once, some small object that unlocked a memory she'd spent 19 years keeping carefully shut away. A second storm caught the coast in late January, milder than the one that had first tested the rebuilt beacon, but still enough to close the causeway for a full day, trapping Emma, Toby, and Sal together in the cottage, with the marine radio on low in the background, out of habit rather than necessity. This time, when a call did come through, faint and garbled, requesting a position check from a research vessel unsure of its bearing in the weather, Emma answered it herself without a second's hesitation, plotting the rough fix the way Frank had once shown her and relaying it over the radio in a voice that didn't shake even slightly. Sal, listening from the kitchen table, caught Toby's eye and gave him a small nod, the kind adults give children when they want them to notice something worth remembering. "That's not luck anymore," Sal told him quietly. "That's just what she does now." By February, Derek had taken to spending most of his free weekends at the light station, not out of obligation anymore, but because, as he admitted once, it was the first place in years that made him feel like part of something older and steadier than his own bad luck. He'd started teaching Toby and Caleb basic engine repair alongside Odom, passing along exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous competence Frank had once passed down to a 9-year-old girl with a chisel and a coil of rope, and Nora, watching her daughters race Toby across the causeway one bright Saturday, told Emma quietly that she hadn't seen her husband this settled in years. Emma had the whole Calloway family over for dinner one Sunday not long after. A cramped, cheerful meal around the cottage's small kitchen table, and Nora, helping clear plates afterward, admitted quietly that she'd spent 2 years resenting a lighthouse she'd never even seen, certain it was the thing standing between her family and financial stability. "I was wrong about what this place was going to cost us," Nora said, looking out the window at Derek and the girls skipping stones by the last of the daylight. "Turns out it was never the expense. It was the thing that was going to save him, and I just couldn't see it from that far away." Emma didn't have a tidy response to that, so she didn't try to give one. She just refilled Nora's coffee and let the two of them sit with it in comfortable silence, the particular quiet of 2 women who'd both spent a year learning the same lesson from different directions. Paul's mother, for her part, never fully came around, but Paul himself softened considerably once he actually drove out one weekend to see the place for himself, watching Toby confidently coil a line on the dock without being asked, and confessing, a little sheepishly, that he'd pictured something considerably more precarious than what he found. The custody arrangement settled itself out over the following months without anyone needing a lawyer, largely because Toby made it plain, in the specific and immovable way children sometimes manage, exactly how much of his life now revolved around a rock at the end of a causeway that flooded twice a day. By spring, Caleb had all but moved his weekends permanently to Cape Merrow, working alongside Sal on other people's boats now instead of just his uncle's, quietly building the kind of reputation around the harbor that Frank himself had once carried, and had started, without telling anyone, leaving small, unasked-for repairs done on neighbors' gear the way he'd once watched an old ledger describe a stranger doing for people who never knew who to thank. Almost exactly a year after Emma had first crossed the causeway with a duffel bag and $9.40 to her name, a young woman appeared at the head of it one warm June evening, carrying a sleeping toddler on one hip and a garbage bag of belongings over the other shoulder, having walked the 2 miles from the bus station because she hadn't had enough left over for a cab. Her name was Marisol, and she explained, haltingly, embarrassed, that she'd left a bad situation 2 towns over that morning and hadn't fully worked out where she was going beyond a way, and that someone at the bus station had mentioned, offhand, that there was a woman out at the old light station who didn't ask too many questions before she helped. Emma stood at the gate for a long moment, looking at a stranger holding a sleeping child, in almost exactly the position Emma herself had once stood in, broke and uncertain, and not at all sure she deserved whatever came next. "I don't have much to offer in return," Marisol said quickly, misreading the silence. "I know how this looks." "It doesn't look like anything you need to apologize for," Emma said. "Come in out of the road. There's a spare room that's had more visitors this year than empty nights, and it could use one more." "Why would you do this for somebody you've never met?" Marisol asked, once the toddler was asleep in the cottage's spare room and she was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't expected to be handed. "Somebody did it for me, once, when I showed up here with about as much as you're carrying right now," Emma said. "Took me the better part of a year and a hidden ledger to understand why he bothered. I'd rather you not have to wait that long to believe it's real." Marisol stayed through the summer, first out of necessity and then, gradually, out of something that looked increasingly like choice, learning the tide tables from Sal the same patient way Emma once had, and teaching her own daughter, barely old enough to talk, to point at the tower every evening and say light, the first word she'd apparently connected to anything beyond her own family. Emma taught her to splice a line one warm evening on the porch, the same way Frank had once taught an 11-year-old girl who'd split a chair spindle clean through with a chisel, guiding Marisol's hands through the motion twice before stepping back to let her try it alone. Marisol fumbled it the first 2 attempts, frustrated in exactly the way Emma remembered being frustrated at that age, and Emma, without quite planning to, heard herself say the sentence that had outlived every other thing she remembered about her own childhood summers. "Nothing's wasted," she said. "Not the line, not the time it takes to get it right. Even a knot that fails teaches your hands something a knot that holds never will." Marisol looked up at her a little strangely at that, the way a person looks at someone repeating words that clearly belong to somebody else, and Emma realized, with a small jolt, that she'd finally become exactly the kind of person Frank always was to her, someone passing forward a lesson she'd never fully asked for and had ended up needing anyway. One quiet evening in early summer, not long after Marisol and her daughter had settled into the rhythm of the place, and almost exactly a year to the day since Emma had first stood at the head of the causeway with $9.40 to her name, Emma stood at the top of the tower, watching the beam sweep its old familiar rhythm out across black water, Toby asleep in the cottage below, and found herself saying Frank's sentence out loud to the empty dark, just to hear it land the way he once had. "No lights wasted. Even the ones nobody's out there looking for get seen by somebody." She had spent most of her adult life believing that the things worth keeping were the ones that came easily, whole and undamaged from the start. It took a condemned lighthouse, a hidden ledger, and a man she'd stopped speaking to 19 years before his death to teach her otherwise. Some lights, she understood now, standing there with the beam sweeping steadily overhead, were never really about the boats that found their way home because of them. They were about the people who kept them burning, long after anyone told them they still had to. Below her, in the cottage, Toby's checked list of names had grown too long for the back of a single school worksheet, and now filled most of a spiral notebook Delia had given him for exactly that purpose. Marisol's daughter had learned 3 new words that week, all 3 of them somehow about the water. Derek's daughters had asked, unprompted, whether they could come back next weekend to help Sal with the boats. None of it was the inheritance Emma had expected when she signed for a condemned tower with $9 to her name. All of it, she was beginning to understand, was the only inheritance that had ever actually mattered.